This is Masad Ayub, and you're listening to the Security Professionals Podcast with Alex Haddox.
Welcome to the introductory episode of the Security Professionals Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Haddox. This is the introductory episode where I explain my background and our goals for this show. This isn't a bragging session. It's more like a resume or an explanation of my experience and training. If you don't know who I am and my background, why would you bother listening to this show? I'm separating the summary of my background and the introduction to the show from the actual episodes themselves. I didn't want talking about myself to distract from what the first guest has to share, and that first guest is Masad Ayub. So first, let's go over my background. I have a broad experience in personal protection and professional security. First, I'm a lifelong martial artist. I've been training in martial arts off and on since 1980. I've studied American Kempo, Hapkido, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and dabbled in Wushu and Chinese Kempo. I'm a certified Kubotan instructor under Soke Tatkuboda himself. I also hold Level 3 instructor credentials in Jim Wagner's reality-based personal protection system. I consider American Kempo to be my core art, which is what I started with back in 1980 at Ed Parker's studio in West Los Angeles. I grew up in a military and law enforcement home. My father served in both the U.S. Marine Corps during World War II and in the Army during Desert Storm, Desert Shield. He finished up as a full bird colonel. My father was my first firearms instructor, and he gave me my first gun, a single-shot 410, at 4 years old. My mother was also an ensign in the Navy during the Vietnam conflict. My uncle served in the Air Force during the Korean conflict. And I have several close cousins that served in the Navy and Army who did tours in both Afghanistan and Iraq after 9/11. And it keeps going back from that. Personally, I briefly attended the U.S. Military Academy at West Point before resigning my commission. That means I'm kind of like the military equivalent of a Harvard dropout. My father also worked as a psychiatrist in the federal prison system for 20 years with a focus on the criminally insane. Because of my father's work, we were constantly under threat of death by convicted murderers, rapists, and serial killers. So we were always under strict security protocols and trained all the time. My family and close friends were judges, attorneys, military, law enforcement, and physicians. I had some of the best personal protection exposure and training that a kid could ever dream of, not to mention adults. I cover that time of my life in more detail in my book, Practical Home Security. As a teenager, I trained in the modern Olympic pentathlon, and this is a competition that combines 5 very different events: running, swimming, shooting, fencing, and horseback riding. I would spend my summers living in the barracks on Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas at their Olympic development camp and trained in all 5 sports. My strongest event was swimming and my weakest was running. Instead of going into law enforcement and physical security, I initially went into cybersecurity. I worked for Symantec for nearly 8 years and was the co-founder and product manager of the Symantec Antivirus Research Center. In addition to my duties of managing the lab, I was also the company's spokesman, and I traveled the world on speaking engagements and giving interviews. And that is where I finally understood my calling. I loved teaching. So I started my own education and training company and went back to school and earned my master's degree in education. I switched from cybersecurity back to my roots of physical security. These days, I'm a certified NRA firearms instructor in 5 disciplines and a chief range safety officer. I'm a member of the ASIS, the International Association of Law Enforcement Firearms Instructors, or ILEFI, and the International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association, or ILETA. I'm also certified by the state of California as a security guard instructor in both firearms and baton. I wrote and produced the top certified online security officer training program for the state of California, which is a 40-hour program. I also wrote and produced the first approved online security guard training for the state of Arizona. And of course, I'm currently working on programs for other states. And I'm a published author. I've written many books and training manuals. My book on personal home security, at last count, has sold in 9 countries and been translated into Greek. I've also been a columnist for Taekwondo Times Magazine since 2009. You can find many of my books and manuals on Amazon.com. Just search for my name. And I'm no stranger to podcasting. I've had a top podcast since 2007 with several million downloads. And the show is called Practical Defense. So that brings us current to this show, the Security Professionals Podcast, and the goals for this program. This is going to be a weekly show with the purpose of helping to keep those in the professional security field current on training subjects, news, and the tactics used by criminals. We're going to review articles, have interviews with experts in security and law enforcement, and talk about modern security techniques. We'll cover everything from the basics, because we can always use refreshers on the basics, to advanced subjects. This show is part of a multifaceted approach to keeping our current students, our future students, and all those who protect others at the top of their game. We have this podcast, but we also have a Twitter feed, a Facebook page, and a Google+, where we will post tips and links to relevant articles. On Twitter, we're Security Pro Pod. Facebook is Sec Pro Podcast. And Google+ is Alex Haddox SPP. And the SPP stands for Security Professionals Podcast. We will use those tools to push out news, tips, and links to interesting articles right to your smartphones. Plus, we have our online programs for California and Arizona security officers. And of course, we're, again, developing programs for other states. And then we have our state-accredited security officer training manuals. Now, we use these manuals in our own facilities, but we also make them available for licensing by other certified training companies. These are beautiful, professionally bound 8.5 by 11, double-sided, 2-column manuals that are hundreds of pages long. They cover the complete state training requirements, and they're like nothing seen before in the security industry for basic guard card training. We work hard to make it as easy as possible for professional security officers to stay current, stay employable, and continue to grow their skills. This show is free to anyone and everyone. Plus, many of the topics will have value for personal protection and those who have concealed carry permits. Private security is a growth industry, and it is continually being given greater and greater responsibility for protecting not just personal property, but the lives of our families when they are in public places. Everyone is safer when private security is well trained. This podcast and our social media feeds are ways of helping everyone. So that will do it for this introductory episode. If you have any tips you would like to share with everyone, a comment on a show, or if you would like to suggest a topic for an upcoming episode, write into podcast@security-training-center.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay aware, stay safe.
When every moment matters and a hand reaches out, when someone gives blood and a life is saved, that moment when heartbreak turns to hope, you're there through the American Red Cross. Every day, the Red Cross responds to nearly 200 neighborhood emergencies, and your support makes it possible. Use this moment to join us today.